Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about cellular respiration. The process of cellular respiration converts foods into ATP. ATP is the energy source needed for growth, needed for mechanisms to take place within our body. Not only humans go through cellular respiration, another example would be plants. Plants go through cellular respiration so that they can take the food that they just made and turn it into ATP to help them grow. The reactants needed for cellular respiration to take place would be glucose or food in general. You would also need oxygen. The products that will come out, so when you are going through cellular respiration, the products would be basically what you are exhaling. So you're going to exhale carbon dioxide in the air. You would also exhale some water. That's why when you exhale in front of a mirror, you would notice that the mirror condenses because you are exhaling some water vapor. And the main product is that for every one glucose molecule we break down, we make about 32 ATP. Some say it's a range from 32 to about 38 ATP molecules for every one glucose molecule you break down. And of course, in your body, you don't only have one glucose molecule, we have way more than that. Now, when plants respire, they would also go through the same process. The plants would take the glucose that they just made from photosynthesis. They would take in oxygen, which is going to go through the stomata pores in the leaves, and the plants are going to go ahead and make the same products. They will release carbon dioxide in the air, and they will release some water, and they will make ATP needed for their growth. The process of photosynthesis is actually the exact opposite of cellular respiration. If we look at the cellular respiration reaction and read it in reverse, it would actually be the photosynthesis reaction. So let's take a look at it together. So plants, to photosynthesize, they take the water, right, from the soil. They take carbon dioxide from the air. They would also need some light, and they would make oxygen, which they will release eventually in the air, and they will make their own food, glucose. Now, cellular respiration to take place, three reactions will have to occur, and they have to occur in the following order. The first one would have to be glycolysis. The second one is the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, and the last one is the electron transport chain. Now, glycolysis, the three reactions, glycolysis, the citric acid, and the electron transport chain, those three reactions are happening, of course, inside of a cell. Whether that cell is an animal cell or a plant cell, as we said, both plants and animal cells can go through cellular respiration. So both of them, those three reactions would be occurring inside of the cells. Now, but where exactly do these reactions take place? Inside of a cell, whether it's an animal cell or plant cell, there is the fluid known as the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm, which is that fluid inside of the cell, this is where glycolysis takes place. The citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, those two reactions take place within an organelle known as the mitochondria. So the mitochondria, this is where those two reactions would take place, and both animal and plant cells have mitochondria. Now, glycolysis, we're going to talk about what happens during glycolysis, but one main product that will come out from glycolysis is some ATP, some energy. Citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle will also release some energy, and the electron transport chain would also release some energy. you notice that the reaction that makes the most ATP is the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is actually very, very important because this is where we make most of our energy. And if we are talking about humans, we cannot survive with the amount of energy made only by glycolysis. So let's assume that only glycolysis would take place. Can we survive on that energy that glycolysis make for a long time? We cannot. So for us to survive, we actually have to make ATP, from each cycle, and we have to go through the electron transport chain because this is where we make most of our energy. This is an image of the mitochondria where the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain takes place. The mitochondria has two membranes. There's this outer membrane right here on the outside. Then there is an inner membrane, and you would notice that the inner membrane kind of folds like so. Inside, right here, deep inside, there is this fluid known as the matrix. Deep inside right here in the matrix, this is where the Krebs cycle takes place. The electron transport chain takes place within the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, so let's start talking about glycolysis, which is the first reaction to take place during aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. Glycolysis is going to take place in the cytoplasm of the cell. And if you break the word glycolysis, you would get glyco, which is basically sugar, and lysis, which is breaking down. So glycolysis is the breaking down of sugar. And you can see right here C6H12O6, which is glucose. When it breaks down during glycolysis, we get 2-pyruvic acid, or sometimes they refer to it as pyruvate. Also, we get ATP. Now, about how many ATP do we get? We make around 2 ATP for each glucose that we break down during glycolysis. We also make some NADH, and if you remember, NADH is similar to the NADPH of photosynthesis, which we said analogy, they're kind of those buckets that are going to carry a bunch of electrons. So NADH are compounds that carry electrons. This image right here shows how complicated glycolysis is. And I'm not going to expect you to know all the steps of glycolysis. The main highlights that I want you to know is that glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. You take one glucose and it will break down into 2-pyruvic acids. And you also make 2 ATP. Now, some of you might ask, I see 2 ATP right here and I see 2 ATP right there. Isn't that a total of 4 ATP that glycolysis is making? That is correct. But the reason why we say that the net amount would only be 2, because you are going to have to use 2 ATP. So if you're using 2 ATP at the very beginning and you make a total of 4, the net profit is only 2. So that's why we say that the product that will come out from glycolysis would be 2 pyruvic acids and 2 ATP molecules. And we're also going to get some of these electron carriers, which are known as the NADH. So those NADH are going to carry those electrons. Those electrons are going to be used later in the following steps that we are going to talk about. Now, after glycolysis is done, we move on to the second cycle that would take place, known as the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. Now, glycolysis, just to mention one thing about glycolysis, is that glycolysis is anaerobic. Anaerobic meaning that it doesn't really require oxygen. So if you don't have a whole lot of oxygen, that's fine. Glycolysis can still take place. Krebs cycle, on the other hand, it does need oxygen. So that's why we say that Krebs cycle, it's an aerobic reaction, meaning that if you don't have enough oxygen, the Krebs cycle is actually not going to be able to take place. You can either call it the Krebs cycle or you can call it the citric acid cycle. Now, the Krebs cycle is not going to take place in the cytoplasm like glycolysis. We're actually moving into the mitochondria. So it's going to take place in the mitochondria matrix, which is that inner space that we've discussed previously. The Krebs cycle, let me show you how complicated the Krebs cycle is. So here is the Krebs cycle right there. As you see, there's so many steps involved with the Krebs cycle. I just want you to know, again, the big picture behind it. I want you to know its location. So the Krebs cycle takes place within the mitochondria matrix. The Krebs cycle needs oxygen because it's an aerobic type of reaction. The main products that will come out is the carbon dioxide, which is the carbon dioxide that you will exhale. So most of the carbon dioxide that you are exhaling is coming from the Krebs cycle. We're also going to make ATP. Now, about how many ATP we make? 2. These are not the numbers of ATP made, by the way. Those forget those green numbers right here. Those are just the steps. So we make some carbon dioxide that we will exhale into the air. Then we make 2 ATP. So what else do we make? We make some NADH and some FADH2. Those two are electron carriers. So one more time, think of them as buckets carrying a bunch of electrons. And again, this is just an analogy that we are thinking of them as buckets carrying a bunch of electrons for us. So far, if we think about glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, how many ATP molecules did we make in total? So we made 2 ATP during glycolysis, and we've also made 2 ATP during the Krebs cycle. So far, we've made about 4 ATP. Now, we said that aerobic respiration, for every 1 glucose molecule you break down, you make around 32 ATP. And so far, we've only made 4. So we need to make 28 more. So those 28 ATP will come out from the electron transport chain. And then so far, we've been collecting electrons. We've collected some electrons during the glycolysis because we've made some of those electron carriers, NADH. And then during the Krebs cycle, we are also carrying electrons, and we're storing those electrons because we've made some NADH and FADH2. What are we going to do with all of these electrons that we've been collecting from glycolysis in the Krebs cycle? We are going to use all of these electrons when we move on to the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain, this is the most important reaction that would take place. This is where we make most of our ATP. As I said, we will make about 28 ATP during the electron transport chain. And the reason why it's called electron, because we are going to use all of these electrons that we've been collecting during glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. Where does the electron transport chain takes place? It takes place within the mitochondria, but not within the matrix. It takes place within the inner membrane of the mitochondria. It's also aerobic, so we do need oxygen. If we don't have enough oxygen, we are not going to be able to go through the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is going to release a bunch of energy, and it's going to also release water. So that water vapor that you will exhale out will come out from the electron transport chain, and lots of ATP will be made. Now, during the electron transport chain, we are going to take all of these electrons that we've been collecting from the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. And as we said, remember, think of the NADH as buckets filled with electrons. And what happens is that those electrons are going to be dumped out. As those electrons are being dumped out, they are going to start descending, and they start kind of like falling down. As the electrons are descending during that electron transport chain, ATP is going to be produced. Now, those buckets filled with electrons, they are not going to be destroyed. We can actually recycle them. So once the NADH releases all of the electrons it's been carrying, it turns into NAD positive, which are just those empty buckets which can be recycled in the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle so that they can get refilled with more electrons. As the electrons during the electron transport chain, as they descend, as I said, ATP will be made. And then at the end, oxygen is going to be around because, as I said, the electron transport chain needs oxygen. So there's going to be oxygen around. Those oxygens are going to combine with the electrons, and they're going to combine with a bunch of hydrogens, and collectively, we're going to go ahead and make the water that we are going to exhale out. So this is a summary of the reactions that take place during our aerobic cellular respiration. And so we have to go through glycolysis, which will result in the production of 2 ATP. Then we move on to the citric acid cycle, which will result in another 2. So that's a total of 4. And then the electron transport will make around 28. Add all of them together, and we've made around 32 ATP molecules per 1 glucose. Glycolysis takes place within the cytoplasm, where the citric acid and the electron transport chain takes place within the mitochondria. Glycolysis produces a bunch of electron carriers, as well as the citric acid cycle also produces a bunch of electron carriers. All of these electron carriers are going to dump out the electrons during the electron transport chain, so that as the electrons start to descend, that's when we're going to make the highest amount of ATP. Anything else I want to mention here is that during the citric acid cycle, this is when we are going to release carbon dioxide. We're going to exhale the carbon dioxide. Electron transport chain, we are going to exhale the water. Now, aerobic respiration involves glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And the reason why it's called aerobic, because both the Krebs cycle and the ETC require oxygen. Well, what if we don't have enough oxygen in our body? We are not going to go through the aerobic respiration. We're going to go through something known as fermentation, or we can refer to it as anaerobic respiration. And anaerobic respiration or fermentation is going to produce some ATP, but not 32 ATP as what we produce during the aerobic respiration. So during the aerobic respiration, as I said, we make around 32 ATP molecules. But if we don't have enough oxygen, we're going to go through the anaerobic respiration, or basically fermentation, and we're actually only going to make 2 ATP molecules. You can see a huge difference in terms of the ATP production. Instead of making 32, we're only going to make 2 ATP molecules. Now, Fermentation would rely mostly on glycolysis because we said glycolysis is an anaerobic respiration. So we don't really have to have a whole lot of oxygen to go through the process of glycolysis. But during fermentation, we are not going to be able to go through the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle because it requires a whole lot of oxygen. Now, you might be wondering, when do we go through fermentation? When do we really not have enough oxygen? For example, during exercise. Yes, when we are exercising, you would notice that we are inhaling more and your breathing rate would be faster. That's because your body is trying to get more oxygen. But even though your breathing rate increases and your body is trying to get more oxygen, it's still not going to be enough for us to go through the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain, and so therefore we're only going to go through glycolysis. And so when we humans go through fermentation, we're going to go through glycolysis where we are going to get the pyruvic acid. Once we get the pyruvic acid, we are going to convert it into lactic acid. And we know that the glycolysis produces 2 ATP. So when we go through fermentation, we're only going to make 2 ATP molecules. And then we take that pyruvic acid that we've just made from glycolysis and we convert it into lactic acid. And lactic acid starts to accumulate in your muscles, adding on to the pain that you would feel when you are exercising. Another organism that goes through fermentation is yeast. Yeast will go through first glycolysis, and so they would take the glucose, break it down into the pyruvic acid. Then they will take the pyruvic acid and they will convert it into carbon dioxide and they will convert it into alcohol. So completely different products will come out from the yeast fermentation versus lactic acid fermentation, which takes place in humans. Humans, we convert our pyruvic acid into lactic acid, and yeast converts the pyruvic acid into carbon dioxide and alcohol. That's why we use yeast to make beer so that we can produce that alcohol. And we also add yeast to bread so that your bread would rise. That's why when you don't add yeast to your bread, it comes out very flat, because if you don't add yeast, then no fermentation will take place and no carbon dioxide will be released, and that carbon dioxide, that gas that will be produced, is what makes the dough rise.